But that's why I can't have to keep it a little tighter. Because otherwise we'd have to buy more packs. Four. If I take this off, I'm going to be hot. I mean, cold. So it's kind of like, you just eat. It's my membrane.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm going to put this and then we're going to start. And I like that. All recording this thing.
Trying to upload this video for the class of like the students.
I did this one. Yeah.
It's so and I got colored pens. Pens don't leak into it. Like I need like yeah. Good for no. Have you guys started looking at parallel? No.
Who's your battery first?
I don't think right though? That's so true.
Can you please take a sip?
No, what? Nano.
Hey, dude. Good.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's almost time to get started, and it is time to put away all your cell phones and personal electronics. Put them in your backpack on the floor and not in your pocket.
Take it! You're so sweet. Yeah, let me know if you need another one. I feel like I'm just gonna get it. I would use that.
While I wait for a microphone, I have a quick announcement. Just as soon as I thought I finally had a schedule done and posted it, your class president contacted me about your heavy midterm week. And so we have moved our first section exam, the general pass section exam, to Monday the 29th, which hopefully will work well. If you don't like where it is now, that's too bad you're stuck with it. But we had to redo the whole schedule, and that's just going to be fun for me to get everything in there, but I think it'll be good.
So April 29th is our sectional.
First section.
As opposed to
The 24th, which was a big exam on Monday, big exam on Tuesday, big exam on Wednesday.
and
so,
clinic in the morning.
yeah, so gotta get this thing closed. Now that it's battery in it.
So it was 24th,
Oh.
and now it's 29th.
29th. So like a week. Tissue repair.
It's hard to close because I have the battery in my messages.
Oh, it's in that.
Oh, I'm in now. Oh,
Okay.
We do have a microphone. It's a little loud though, so I'm going to turn it down a teeny. I do like to start class with a word of prayer, so bow your heads with me. Gracious Father in heaven, the day is half done, but we still have important things to accomplish. I pray that you will help each student here to learn new things that will help them take excellent care of the patients you send to them. And I pray that you will help them on their quiz in the class to follow, give them wisdom and sound thinking, and peace and calm hearts, so they can do their very best. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So today we continue our discussion of inflammation. We have been on this topic for a little bit. Oh, come on. It says no thank you. Aha, yes. So we continue our discussion of inflammation today. And you will recall that there's more than one type of inflammation, and we have been focusing on acute inflammation, which is that very generic immediate host response to tissue injury that has the job of neutralizing the assault so no further injury can occur, which is especially important for infections, but also is true for other forms of assault, and then clean up the mess that the injury has created. You will recall that in order for acute inflammation to occur, we had to have vascular changes and cellular events that come together to accomplish those goals of neutralizing the assault. And our major changes for vascular events were vasodilation to increase the amount of incoming blood, which we call hyperemia. The local blood vessels are dilated and engorged with fresh blood, bringing in all kinds of mediators and cells and everything else. And the other major vascular change was increased vascular permeability, which allowed a lot of things in the bloodstream to leak out into the tissue, which also provides mediators, but also provides cells to clean up the mess and neutralize the assault. So those were things that we talked about. You'll recall that exudation was a major feature of acute inflammation, that outpouring of plasma proteins and white blood cells, if needed, and that only happens when blood vessels are leaky, not when we have a normal permeability level of blood vessel membrane. So we start today, since we kind of finished our discussion of acute inflammation, we start today with our discussion of chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation is very complicated, and so we're really just going to do an overview primarily for the purpose of contrasting it to acute inflammation so you recognize major differences. And we pick up bits and pieces of chronic inflammation as it applies to additional topics that we will study this quarter. Acute inflammation was a quick and dirty process. It happens very, very quickly after the injury, gets the job done, then it's done, over. Finished, kaput. In contrast, chronic inflammation takes longer to develop, takes longer to get going, but once it is present, it is much more persistent and present for a long duration of time. Depending on the underlying etiologic factor, it could be present for weeks or months or even years. So it can be a very, very long process. Most of the time, not always, but most of the time, chronic inflammation is immune-mediated. So what does that mean?
It's directed by the immune response.
It's a directed immune response. Directed, what's directing it? What is always at the heart of things? Well, the immune system is part of acute inflammation too. But what do we mean by immune-mediated? Immune-mediated means that it's a host response, an immune host response to a specific antigen. It always requires recognition of a specific antigen, meaning that it's not generic. Whereas our acute inflammation was very generic, there are so many ways you could get to it. You don't have to recognize specific antigens. It doesn't mean that there aren't antigens present, and they can be recognized, but it's not essential, and it's not a response to just a single antigen. Whereas immune-mediated responses are a response to a specific antigen. It's a very targeted, selective response. And a little bit later, we are going to talk about specific types of immune reactions, specifically related to pathologic immune reactions. But we'll have an opportunity to see chronic inflammation again then. When we talked about acute inflammation, we talked about the different things that are going on in the mechanism, and we had some diagrams. We didn't really have pictures, but we had some diagrams of what was present in the tissue. So if you look in the tissue with acute inflammation, what would you see? What kind of cells would be present?
Neutrophils.
Neutrophils and macrophages. Anything else? What would we see? Not going to see eosinophils. That would be a random event. Not cells, other types of things. The cells we see are neutrophils and macrophages.
Exudate.
We're going to see the exudate. We're going to see the extra fluid in the tissue, and we may be able to recognize which type of exudate it is. And we're going to see those dilated and engorged blood vessels. So there were very specific changes we would see in the tissue. If we look in the tissue in chronic inflammation, it looks very different. The cells are different, and what's present in the tissue is different. And it's just as important what isn't there as is what is there. The cells that are present, the chronic inflammatory cells, are what we refer to collectively as mononuclear leukocytes, meaning that we're not going to see any polymorphonuclear leukocytes. So what are the polymorphonuclear leukocytes? The ones that have the lobated nucleus, looks like a string of pearls, which would be neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. So we're not going to see those types of cells. We're going to see the other types of inflammatory cells. And we'll talk about that in a moment. We are also going to have some component of tissue destruction, which is very unfortunate. But chronic inflammation is very powerful, and the cells that are recruited and the mediators that they produce virtually always produces some type of tissue destruction. If the process only lasts a few weeks, the destruction may be minimal. If it's lasting for months or years or decades, it can be very significant. So tissue destruction is a characteristic. So we're going to see some damage and loss of cells, of host cells. Another thing that we see is scarring. The more tissue destruction there is, the more scarring that we will see. And we're going to see that as a proliferation of fibroblasts, and those fibroblasts will be making collagen. So that's what we're going to see with that scarring. And again, the scarring can be minimal or it can be significant depending on how long that chronic inflammatory process is present and how intense it is as well. So what are the cells that are what we call chronic inflammatory cells that are those mononuclear leukocytes? What does mononuclear mean? One nucleus, a single nucleus instead of the multilobated nucleus like the polymorphonuclear leukocytes. So one of the inflammatory cells that we see in chronic inflammation is the macrophage, or tissue histiocytes. Macrophages are the one cell that we see in both types of inflammation. They perform some additional functions in chronic inflammation that may not be called upon in acute inflammation, but they're a very important cell in chronic inflammation. We see lymphocytes, and those come in more than one variety, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. We see plasma cells. Do you know what plasma cells are?
Antibodies.
They make antibodies. They make antibodies. So those are the ones that we collectively refer to as mononuclear cells. In some chronic inflammatory reactions, we see only macrophages and certain types of lymphocytes and no plasma cells. In other situations, we may see lots and lots of plasma cells and not many of the other types of lymphocytes. So there's a lot of variety in how these different cells are combined and what proportions that they are combined. So we already talked about why we call them mononuclear cells. So let's talk a little bit about what those different types of cells are doing in chronic inflammation. Macrophages in chronic inflammation will be doing something that they do very, very well, and that is phagocytosis. So they will be engulfing and breaking down things as needed. Sometimes that function is highly needed, other times not so much. But another very important function of macrophages in chronic inflammation is to produce chemical mediators that direct other cells, tell other cells what to do, and guide other processes. It is believed that over 200 substances can be manufactured by macrophages. So they do lots and lots and lots of different things. I'm not going to make you learn all the different specific mediators that macrophages produce, but some of them have the purpose of recruiting more white blood cells, recruiting lymphocytes, recruiting plasma cells, predominantly lymphocytes. Some of those mediators are directly responsible for the tissue destruction. So macrophages play a very major role in tissue destruction and also in fibrosis. So macrophages can produce growth factors that stimulate the proliferation of fibroblasts and can also produce factors that tell those fibroblasts to make collagen. So scar tissue, a lot of that is directed by macrophages. So they're a very important cell in chronic inflammation. Lymphocytes do all kinds of things depending on what kind of lymphocyte they are, and there are several different ones. The majority of them that we need to know about are the B cells and the T cells. We call them B cells and T cells so often that we forget that they're lymphocytes, but they are B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. What other kinds of lymphocytes are there? Heard of NK cells, natural killer cells, and there are null cells and a few other ones too. So the B lymphocytes are primarily involved in antibody-mediated immune responses, where those B cells learn to recognize a single antigen and then terminally differentiate into plasma cells, which make antibodies against that single specific antigen. Then we have our cell-mediated immune responses that involve the interaction of T lymphocytes and macrophages. Sometimes macrophages have a big role in cell-mediated immune responses. Sometimes it's predominantly the T cells. And T cells can do some very interesting things. We can also have chronic inflammation that's not immune-mediated. It doesn't require recognition of an antigen, where acute inflammation fails and we get a gradual transition to chronic inflammation just to intensify the response to try to neutralize the assault and clean up the mess. And so that we tend to see a more generic combination of our chronic inflammatory cells. What do T lymphocytes do? Well, an important thing that we see in chronic inflammation is that the T lymphocytes and the macrophages talk to each other. T lymphocytes produce gamma interferon, which activates the macrophages, and the macrophages produce other mediators, some of which stimulate the T cells, so they kind of have this self-reinforcing cycle. But one of the things they stimulate each other to do is produce the mediators that are going to produce the effects that they need to produce. So that's an important aspect of what T cells do is work collaboratively with those macrophages. I want to back up before I leave T cells. One of the things that T cells can do is kill. So you know what cytotoxic T cells are? You've studied cytotoxic T cells. So they can attach to a target cell by a specific receptor, a specific ligand, and activate the death receptor pathway that causes apoptosis. So one of the ways that T cells kill cells is by telling them to commit suicide. Gives them the message, you've been selected to die, go die. So that's what they do. So that's an important thing, I think, that T cells do. Plasma cells, those terminally differentiated lymphocytes, B lymphocytes, make antibodies. Why do we call them plasma cells? Does anybody know?
Because they originate.
Not because they originate in the plasma. They come from immunoblasts in lymphoid follicles, and then they differentiate, and they're in the tissue. They're called plasma cells because the antibodies circulate in the plasma. Antibodies are a major component of plasma, so we call them plasma cells because they make so much plasma. Nobody ever tells you that, so I thought I would mention it. So antibodies do a lot of different things, but they have two major roles. Some antibodies promote phagocytosis by serving as an opsonate. Which antibody was that? We've already studied that.
And
IgG. IgG is the one that promotes phagocytosis. And the other thing is promoting cell lysis by activation of complement. And any antibody, once it binds with its antigen target to produce an antigen-antibody complex, can activate complement and can do a few other things as well. But cell lysis, which is important in destruction of microbes, plays a role, and then opsonization plays a role. Those are major functions of antibodies. There are some other ways that antibodies function, but if you know those two major ones, that covers a lot of territory. So, I think that's all I want to say in our quick and dirty overview of chronic inflammation. And what I'd like to do now is look at morphologic patterns of inflammation. I think I need less light. Okay. We talked about how when you wanted to know if a cell was dying, you looked at the nucleus of the individual cell. But when we see collections of cells that are dying at a tissue level, then there were morphologic patterns of necrosis, coagulative necrosis, liquefactive necrosis. Well, we have that same kind of concept with inflammation. You know, we've talked about inflammation, you know, like it's happening with one or two cells or something this teeny. But we see it on a tissue scale, and depending on the pattern, whether it's acute or chronic, or it's acute in which specific exudate is predominating, we have several very specific, very recognizable patterns of inflammation in tissue. Some of these are recognizable just really morphologically by looking at the tissue under the microscope, but others of them are actually pretty recognizable grossly or clinically in a patient. So we're going to talk about them. We should know some defining characteristics of these morphologic patterns of inflammation and some examples, major examples, because you will probably see major examples. So these are the ones we're going to look at, and rather than define them here, we will define them as we go through them. Serous inflammation is what happens in the tissue when we have a minor injury that produces an acute inflammatory response that can get the job done by only going as far as producing a serous exudate. And you'll remember that a serous exudate has water and electrolytes and small molecules and some small plasma proteins, but not a lot of protein. Just a little bit of protein and small proteins. So it's kind of a thin, watery fluid. And a very good example of serous inflammation is when you get an injury that produces a blister. This is one of my former dental students who went to the beach and got a bad sunburn. Do you see the hyperemia with the acute inflammation? Oh, yes. So I don't have to tell you that's acute inflammation. If we touched it, what would it feel like? Hot. That calor would be there. If you've ever had a sunburn, you know how hot it is. Can you see how it's kind of bumpy, the way it reflects light? It's a little bumpy. It's a bad sunburn with a blister, a blistering sunburn. So the blister part is our serous inflammation. Yeah. I got a really, really bad sunburn on a field trip in the 4th grade. We went to the beach. It was before they had sunscreens. And I got so sick I had to take 2 days off school. And when my shoulders peeled, it peeled in sheets of skin like this. I had enormous blisters. I wish I had pictures, because that would have been such a whopping example of serous inflammation. Fibrinous inflammation. We move on. Fibrinous inflammation occurs in diseases that have a little more serious injury in the tissues. It generates an acute inflammatory response where the exudate that occurs, that develops, is a fibrinous exudate. So when we have that outpouring of fibrinogen into the tissue with our fibrinous exudate, the fibrinogen is converted to fibrin, and we get this stringy material that forms in the tissue. A lot of times when we have fibrinous inflammation, it involves an injury at or near a surface, and the fibrinous inflammation produces a layer of fibrin that coats the surface and sets up and creates kind of a tough protected layer, and it actually helps protect the area of injury. Sometimes we get fibrinous exudate in places we don't want it, where it actually creates problems like in body cavities. The picture that we have here is a heart in a person who died. I believe this one was rheumatic heart disease, acute rheumatic heart disease. It's very unusual to die from that, but this person did. And if you look at the pericardial surface of the heart, it looks a little grainy and yellowy tan. That's fibrin that's on the surface. Another name for fibrinous pericarditis is bread and butter pericarditis. Have you ever taken 2 pieces of bread with butter on them, put them together, and decided you wanted to put something else in there and pull it apart and have the butter kind of spike? You know how it kind of spikes up and looks irregular? Fibrinous pericarditis, the surface kind of looks spiky and a little bit yellowish like that. So pathologists like to name things after food, so they called it bread and butter pericarditis. But that fibrin is very tough. If this person had lived, then our acute inflammatory host response would have had to remove all that fibrin. And if it couldn't remove it fast enough, repair cells would move in and actually replace the fibrin layer with scar tissue. And that can allow the pericardial sac to scar down onto the pericardial surface, epicardial sac. So that creates some functional problems, because you have a sac of scar tissue around the heart, it doesn't let it fill up. So sometimes having fibrinous exudate on the surface of a body cavity promotes scar tissue formation in that body cavity. And it's kind of weird stuff too. I did an autopsy on a gentleman who died from congestive heart failure, had a lot of fluid in his lungs, and it was kind of yellowish. You could see through it, but it was semi-solid. It was like half-set lemon jello, kind of. And I actually picked some up in my hand. You could pick it up in your hand, it would mound up. And I squeezed it, and the liquid ran out, and when I opened my hand, it just had little white strings, little fibery stuff. That was the fibrin. So his chest cavities were just full of fibrinous exudate. So much so there was no room for his lungs to expand, and he basically suffocated because he couldn't breathe. So it can fill up a body cavity, or it can scar down a body cavity. So it can be a problem. We see it in lots of different diseases. I've listed heart examples, but lots and lots of different diseases can produce fibrinous inflammation. The next type of inflammation is suppurative inflammation. And suppurative means purulent, basically. It is pus-producing. So that means the injury is going to produce a purulent exudate as part of the acute inflammatory response. And we have 2 different, basically clinical patterns of suppurative inflammation, 2 major clinical patterns of suppurative inflammation, depending on if that production of purulent exudate is localized or not localized. So the localized one is an abscess, where we have a standoff between our host defenses and a microorganism. So abscesses are almost always infections. It's possible to get a sterile abscess. There are a very limited number of diseases that produce sterile abscesses, but the overwhelming majority of the time, an abscess is an infection where the host is keeping it contained, so it's sharply defined and contained, but during that, inside that little containment area, we have active infection and active pus production. This is an example of an abscess in the lung, and you can see it is sharply defined, and this is mostly purulent exudate. Why is it white? All those are white blood cells. And fibrin. There's a lot of fibrin in there too. Not always, but very frequently, abscesses are produced by staphylococcal bacteria. On the skin, Staph aureus is a major one, but other types of staph. So abscesses are famous for being caused by staph organisms. Our dental abscess is usually caused by staph. I'll let you think about that for a minute. There's my dental abscesses. Here's one that's coming up onto the cheek. It's still contained, but it's a really big one. This is one where 2 teeth that are infected, where the exudate has found the path of least resistance and has created a gum boil just underneath the surface, may actually break through and drain and become an active sinus tract. So our abscesses usually caused by staph when they're dental abscesses.
I'm sorry, what is that again?
Oh, we call those gum boils, also known as a parulus. We'll see those again later this quarter. You'll get to learn the name for that then. But those are abscesses. Sometimes we just see them on the x-rays, but usually you can see the active drainage in one. They are not usually caused by staph. Why is that? Because staph is not an oral microbe. It's not usually our normal inhabitants of the mouth, and most tooth-related infections are oral microbes, come from the oral flora. Oh, so now these are really big abscesses with a lot of swelling and a lot of exudation, and we're starting to lose containment. Have you noticed? Not so localized, not so contained. So we're kind of moving into cellulitis now. And so the other type of suppurative, clinical pattern of suppurative inflammation is cellulitis. And cellulitis is a spreading infection that produces a purulent exudate. It is spreading because most of the time it is an infection involving streptococcal microorganisms, and strep bacteria can produce hyaluronidase, which actually breaks down the ground substance in our connective tissues, so it just dissolves the connective tissue so it can spread. It can really spread pretty fast. My sister is a CPA, and she used to do public accounting, and she did an audit in a construction company. Do you think construction company offices are super clean? You are correct, they are not. So she had kind of a scratchy wool dress on in the winter one day, and that night when she got home from being out in the field at the construction office, she had a little tiny red spot on her elbow, slightly swollen, little red spot. She thought, oh, that's interesting. When she woke up the next morning, her arm was swollen like 3 times as big as usual, almost up to her shoulder. And that was cellulitis, from an infection that spread that fast just overnight. And she had to go to the ER and spent 3 days in the hospital on IV antibiotics. It was a little scary. So cellulitis can spread very, very quickly because the organism can directly break down tissue, allowing it to spread through the tissues. It's still going to be red. It's still going to have exudate. You can lance an abscess and drain it and evacuate all those organisms and speed healing. Can you lance cellulitis? No, you can't pop it because it's all over. So it makes it a lot harder to treat. This is a really bad place to get cellulitis. This was a maxillary tooth that was abscessed and lost containment. When we get around the eye, we are right next to the cavernous sinus, which is a vessel for venous drainage that communicates with the brain and does not have backflow valves. So you get an infection in this area, you get cellulitis in this area, it can spread to the brain very easily, it can be lethal. So that one's now an emergency situation. And you can see really severe cellulitis around her eye, and she's actually in the hospital being prepped for surgery to eliminate the source of the infection. But she's at very, very high risk of cavernous sinus thrombosis and infection in the brain. So, yes?
How do they surgically do that? Are they lifting your
Now, for her, they are not surgically getting rid of the cellulitis. They are getting rid of the source of the infection. So this was it started with a tooth, and you're not going to control the infection without getting rid of the source tooth. So they were going to do surgical extraction on the tooth and then treat her with high-dose IV antibiotics and hope she survives and that it didn't get to the brain. She's in a very bad place right now. That's very, very serious, life-threatening infection. Another morphologic pattern of inflammation is membranous inflammation, where we get a surface membrane of exudate on the surface of a barrier. So not internal things so much as like the surface of the gut epithelium, sometimes oral mucosa. Is often a fibrinopurulent exudate, but it sits on top of a fairly intact barrier. We see this with candidiasis. Have you studied Candida albicans? Yeah, I'm sure you have in micro. It's a common oral infection. And the organisms sit right on top, and we get some inflammation that can produce some exudate that sits right on top with the Candida organisms. Diphtheria, which we hardly ever see anymore because of immunizations, does the same thing, creates a really thick coat. But we can see it in the gut. Pseudomembranous enterocolitis, caused by overgrowth of Clostridium difficile, is famous for producing membranous inflammation. It looks kind of nasty. You see the red from the inflammation, and then you see the creamy stuff, the creamy yellow, and that's from the membranous part where the exudate is sitting on the surface. And you can see histologically intact gut mucosa with our exudate sitting right on top. Yes?
I have a question. I just want to be sure. So is the candidiasis one of the first things in HIV or HIV symptoms for dental patients? Is that the same thing?
Candidiasis is the earliest opportunistic infection in HIV patients. We often see it in the mouth with HIV patients, but everybody else can get it too. It is an opportunist, but it doesn't just take advantage of HIV. And that's one that we are going to spend quite a bit of time on when we get to oral infections. Question? The name of the disease is pseudomembranous enterocolitis, but the pattern of inflammation is membranous inflammation.
It's picture A and so do picture.
One is gross and one is histologic, and it's the same case. Yes. Yes. All right. Ulceration. We're going to see lots of ulcers, so we should know what an ulcer is. An ulcer is a very specific pattern of change that occurs at a barrier surface when there's loss of epithelium, or if it's internal, it could be loss of serosa, but usually it's a surface epithelium. So we have loss of epithelium, naked exposed connective tissue, and we get an acute inflammatory host response that has a layer of acute inflammation that's producing a layer of fibrinopurulent exudate, and then if it doesn't heal fast enough, we can sometimes see some chronic inflammation underneath. So just because we're missing the epithelium doesn't make it an ulcer. The epithelium had to be missing long enough to have the host response that generates acute inflammation with this layer of fibrinous exudate across the top. So, very specific pattern. How many of you have had a canker sore? That is an ulcer. And you know there's kind of creamy tan on the surface? That's your exudate layer. That's your fibrinous exudate on the top of your ulcer. Forms the top layer of the ulcer. This is a decubitus ulcer on the left. That's a pressure sore where pressure produces ischemia that kills the epithelium, and then you get your ulceration and your inflammation, and The gooey stuff on top is our wet exudate. It's kind of weepy and goopy. And this is a traumatic ulcer in the mouth where the patient bit through the epithelium, and that's why there's a hole in the epithelium. Bit through the epithelium while the cheek was still numb after a dental appointment. And now see the creamy tan color? That's our fibrinous exudate forming a new surface. And then we have inflammation underneath. So that's ulceration. The last of our morphologic patterns of inflammation is the most unique, and that is granulomatous inflammation. It is the only one of the patterns that is only chronic inflammation. There is no component of acute inflammation. There is no exudation present in granulomatous inflammation. Instead, what we get are granulomas. And granulomatous inflammation is diagnosed histologically. It's not something that you see clinically, you see it histologically. So what is a granuloma? A granuloma is a round collection of special inflammatory cells where the macrophages are enlarged and activated and look more like squamous cells, more like big fat pancake cells. So we call those epithelioid histiocytes, but they're just macrophages, very active. And then we see lymphocytes around the edge and sometimes plasma cells too. And we see multinucleated giant cells. What are the multinucleated giant cells? They represent fused macrophages because if they fuse together, they have greater power to accomplish their goal. So they collaborate. And when we see this collection together, we call that a granuloma. There are not a lot of diseases that produce granulomatous inflammation. One of them that does is tuberculosis. There are some others as well, but it is characteristic of tuberculosis. We can see it with foreign body reactions too if you get foreign material embedded in your tissue. Can you see the granulomas? See how they're round collections and they're kind of pale? It's the epithelioid histiocytes that make it pale. And then the little dark blue cells at the edges and in between are the lymphocytes. Do you see any of the giant cells? There's a multinucleated giant cell right there. One big cell with multiple nuclei. Yeah. So we saw this picture before when we were talking about the caseous necrosis that occurs in tuberculosis. And I told you that the grayish area around the cheesy white necrotic stuff is where there is active infection. That grayish area is where we would see the granulomatous inflammation. And it's producing some consolidation of the tissues because of all of the inflammatory cells that are present. So those grayish solid areas are granulomatous inflammation trying to destroy the acid-fast bacilli that are causing it. Anyway, there it is. This is tuberculosis, and this is our granuloma in the middle. We have dead tissue. This is our area of caseous necrosis. And this is a beautiful multinucleated giant cell. There it is, blown up. It has a special name when the nuclei line up like a horseshoe, because they don't always do that, but they're kind of cool. Kind of cool. There we go. So that's granulomatous inflammation. Any questions about inflammation? Then let's move on to our new topic for the afternoon, which is tissue repair. So we've talked about how disease occurs at a cellular level, and we can have injuries that cause loss of cells, necrosis of cells. And we've talked about acute inflammation being the host response to that injury. So we move on to repair because acute inflammation has cleaned up the mess, and now we have to restore the tissue. So repair is the process whereby we restore cells that have been lost. They have been lost or destroyed, usually destroyed, but we need to replace those now missing cells with living cells. Acute inflammation is very important in the process. So the injury happens, the acute inflammatory response immediately thereafter, and actually repair starts not long after that. but acute inflammation is always one step ahead. Neutralizing the assault and cleaning up the mess so repair can take place. There are two major pathways for repair, for replacement of lost cells. One of them is regeneration of parenchyma, and the other is replacement by a generic scar tissue patch, which we refer to as connective tissue repair. What is parenchyma? Is that a word you've heard before? Yes. You've heard it before in what?
Plants, biology.
In plant biology. I'm not a plant biologist. So in humans, what is parenchyma?
Connective tissue.
Mesenchymal cells. I hear connective tissue. No, none of the above. When you have a specialized organ, it always has a generic connective tissue framework, the walls, that kind of create structure for the organ. But then it has the specialized cells that do the specialized job of the organ. Those specialized cells are what we refer to as the parenchyma of an organ. They are the specialized functional cells of an organ. So ordinary mesenchyme is usually a little more generic. Mesoderm does produce specialized tissues like skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle and things like that. But the generic tissue in between would not be parenchyma. So we're talking about the specialized cells. I want to back up, and then I'll take your question. If you have an injury, which of these methods of repair would be the most desirable? A scar tissue patch or replacement of parenchyma? Regenerate the parenchyma. Regeneration of parenchyma is the best because the same type of cell that was lost will be replaced. And so you're going to restore the same function. So that's the most desirable type, but it may not be the type you always get. Back to your question.
I'm just trying to connect the dots. When you talk about inflammation and chronic or acute, you would just say that's, we talked about like reversible cell injury. That's all reversible cell injury.
So inflammation is a response to injury. The injury came before. But chronic inflammation, being very, very potent, can cause additional injury. And if there wasn't an injury to begin with, if it's immune-mediated, it's a response to an antigen, it may be the only thing that's initiating injury.
Okay, so you know how you mentioned about the caseous,
Caseous necrosis?
Yes, necrosis, and that's...
So what caused that? The tuberculosis caused that.
Okay.
And then there's the inflammation. So the host response doesn't cause the necrosis. The infection causes the necrosis. Does that help? All right. We move on. Not really? I'm sorry.
I'll have to just study it.
And think about it some more. Okay. Send me an email when you get more questions. We'll work on it some more. Clearly, regeneration of the same type of cell that was lost is the ideal repair situation. But in order for that to happen, we have to have a population of cells available that has the capacity to divide and replicate, to proliferate, to replace the cells that were lost. And sometimes that is because we have some stem cells in the area that have the ability to replicate and differentiate into the cell type that was lost. And sometimes there's like a basal cell. There's a baseline population of cells that's just in the business of making replacements. And so they make replacements when we lose cells. So there are several different ways that we can have a resource for cells to replicate to replace the ones that were lost. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, the ability to replicate is inversely proportional to the degree of cell differentiation, which translates to the more specialized the cell, the less likely it is that it can regenerate, which we do not like, but that's the way it is. So we have to live with it. All of the cells in the body can be classified into groups based on their capacity for regeneration. We kind of call that their proliferative potential. And their proliferative potential is going to help predict their capacity for repair by regeneration. Makes sense. We group them by where they live and have their being relative to the cell cycle. You remember studying the cell cycle in basic biology. So we have cells that are doing their business out, do whatever it is, but they can enter the cell cycle and produce offspring. Others kind of live in it all the time, and others never go back to it. So that kind of defines what our 3 cell groups are when we divide them into proliferative potential groups. We have the labile cells that are continuously dividing, that kind of live in the cell cycle all the time. Basically, their job is to produce more cells on a regular, ongoing basis. Then we have the stable cells. They're the ones that live at G0. Another name for stable cells are quiescent cells. So their function is not to divide and replicate. They have some other function. But when properly stimulated, they can enter the growth cycle, the cell cycle, and produce additional cells. And then we have permanent cells where they are not dividing. Permanent cells, once they have left the cell cycle, they don't go back into it. So we want to look at each of these in a little more detail. And think of examples. So the labile cells that are continuously in the cell cycle and multiplying and proliferating to produce other cells to replace ones that are normally lost. These are going to be seen in areas where we have a high attrition rate for normal cells and have a high demand for ongoing replacements. They, therefore, will very easily regenerate if we have an injury in those tissues. They regenerate the fastest usually because they're already geared up to divide. They're already in the process. They just make more when we have an injury. Good examples of labile cells are the basal cells in epithelium and surface epithelium, or sometimes in columnar cells. They're little reserve cells. They don't make quite the same way a basal cell layer. But they're always producing replacements for epithelial cells that are shed from the surface. So if we get an injury in epithelium, we can regenerate epithelium, that type, surface epithelium, very easily. Bone marrow stem cells. Bone marrow stem cells make what?
Blood.
Blood, red blood cells, white blood cells, what else? Platelets. So, and that's their job. They're always making things. So if we get a bone marrow injury, it usually can heal very well, can regenerate very well. We take advantage of that when we do bone marrow transplants. You just have to harvest a little bit of bone marrow from your donor, put it in the bloodstream, you infuse it in the bloodstream of the recipient, it finds its way to the bone marrow, and it takes up housekeeping, can regenerate an all new bone marrow in a matter of weeks. So amazing what bone marrow can do. So those are our labile cells. Stable cells are a little bit longer discussion, so I think we should take a break before we talk about our stable cells. We'll take a 10-minute break, come back and start right on the hour. No, I didn't want to do that.
No, I just have
Yes.
Why can't you regenerate alveolar bone?
What? I'm not sure what you're asking.
So when you have resorption from alveolar bone, like in the teeth, why can't you regenerate that?
You can. But getting bone height is a problem because the problem is the attachment with the tooth. And when we can't get the attachment for the tooth, the new bone doesn't survive and it starts shrinking. So they do bone grafts. They can raise the level, but if the attachment is still compromised, it'll disappear. The bone regenerates very well.
Okay.
Okay.
So examination
I have
from the
that.
24th to 29th. Yeah. But it was at 9 tomorrow. We're out 9. Yes.
Christy was like,
Tired. Are you okay? Feeling a little tired. Yeah. A little happy day. You could say that.
Oh yeah, you should be
literally thought that. I'm saying. Yeah.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
I was just like,
Slowly.
that's the root that's
It's all the vegetables that happens whenever I eat it.
Like I do feel surgery recommended, but I haven't felt like that. I know it's there, but I'm a little bit nervous. It's so nice knowing how it physically feels. Yeah.
That's what I saw when you turned around. Like,
like this for a minute. Got it. Oh wait. T-shirt on.
this past week, that's why I would like to because I started
I need my belly and my
And then when I have one, that reminds me of that.
Oh, that'll wake us up for a few minutes.
It was like a big file. So
It was like the weekend.
I'll try sending it to my laptop.
You have to wear silicone.
Well, that's what I thought it was going to be okay. When I started doing injections, it wasn't even like this part. It went like down to this.
No, you're like my
It didn't send.
Didn't send?
No.
Wow, it's probably just a big file.
So you think it'll just take longer for it to send? It says it uploaded, but it said it'll take a while to be posted.
Oh, Facebook?
Yeah, that's what Facebook.
Oh, okay.
It was only, well, I mean, it was like 3 minutes.
Oh, it's only 3 minutes? Oh, okay. That should be 2 minutes. You could upload to YouTube.
You're right. I might do that.
Like this.
Like, I started these I know.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for us to put our cell phones back away because I know you guys all got them out. So put them back away. You didn't. I'm so proud of you. Those professional boundaries. Awesome. Anyway, so we go back to business. And we were talking about the different types of the cells in the body that have different proliferative potential and therefore have different capacities for regeneration in a setting where these cells have been destroyed. So we can kind of predict if we're going to get replacement by a scar tissue patch or if we can regenerate the same cell that was lost. So we move on to the stable cells. The stable cells are the ones that live in G0, doing their job, but not actively dividing. Their job is not actively dividing. When they are in the right setting, they can be coaxed back into this cell cycle to produce offspring. So they have, by definition, the latent capacity to regenerate. However, within this group of stable cells, which is actually the majority of cells of the body, we have a very, very wide range of proliferative capacity. So some cells, we have to really push them hard to get them to go back into the cell cycle, and they may only be able to produce a few more cells. Whereas others, they're just really happy to go back in the cell cycle, and they'll just stay there until you tell them to stop. So there's a quite a wide range of proliferative potential. But again, only certain circumstances will stimulate them to enter into the cell cycle, and repair is one of them. Examples. So most of our solid organ specialized cells, those parenchymal cells of internal organs, fall into this category. Liver cells, so hepatocytes, our pancreatic cells, our acinar cells, kidney cells, salivary gland acini, and ductal structures, thyroid, those glandular types of cells, organs, usually fall within this category. But even within that group, there's a wide range of proliferative capacity. Liver has tremendous capacity for regeneration. It doesn't do it all the time, but it has tremendous capacity. That's a good thing because you can't live without a liver. Whereas tissues like kidney and thyroid, minimal. Much, much less regenerative capacity. Salivary glands, pretty limited. We can regenerate the ductal structures a lot more easily than the acinar structures, but what do we need? The acinar structures that produce the product. So we're kind of stuck and don't always get as much regeneration as we want. The other group of cells that are stable cells are the mesenchymal cells that produce our generic framework connective tissue. Fibroblasts, endothelial cells that line blood vessels, smooth muscle cells that form the walls of arteries and arterioles. Those are all stable cells, and those cells have tremendous regenerative capacity and are very happy to enter the cell cycle and produce offspring. And we take advantage of that because they're the cells that are responsible for connective tissue repair, the process of producing a scar tissue patch. There are other cells that are mesenchymal cells that fall into that category. Bone regenerates very well. Bone repairs very well if there's an injury or a surgery. So that's a good thing. Then we get to the permanent cells. These are terminally differentiated cells that once they reach that stage of terminal differentiation, they have left the growth cycle, the cell cycle for good, and cannot replicate. We have some very important cells that fall into this category, and we know some interesting things about them. Neurons, terminally differentiated, extremely highly specialized, cannot regenerate. Cardiac muscle cells, highly specialized, cannot regenerate. Skeletal muscle cells, in all practical capacity, cannot regenerate. So these are terminally differentiated and can't divide. What about stem cells that can differentiate into them? So we actually know from research that we can grow new neurons from stem cells, not from the adult neurons we already have, but from stem cells. Same with cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle. It's just that we don't have many of those stem cells natively. And one of the obstacles that we have with repairing brain tissue is that even if you can grow a new neuron to replace one that's been lost, can you teach it to do the job of the one that was lost? And that continues to be a huge obstacle. They're actually making some headway in research with stem cells to replace lost cardiac muscle. That may happen in my lifetime, maybe my lifetime if I'm lucky. Skeletal muscle has some of its own stem cells, but it's such a limited amount that in all practicality it behaves as a permanent tissue. So for now, we have to accept that neurons, cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle behave as permanent tissues, even though we know research may break that barrier in the future. So let's talk about repair by connective tissue. The good thing about connective tissue repair, where we produce a scar tissue patch, is that the patch is very strong, and so it restores integrity to the tissue. It holds it together. And that's an important aspect of tissue repair, is holding the tissue together. But the scar tissue doesn't have functionality. All it really is a patch. So we lose specialized function of cells that were lost, specialized cells in the area that were lost. Because the cells that are involved in producing scar tissue divide very readily and very easily, they tend to regenerate faster than specialized cells regenerate, and so we tend to see a lot more scarring than we do regeneration of specialized tissues. It's unfortunate but true. When we have connective tissue repair, since it is a common process, it involves several processes. One of the important things to know about scar tissue repair is that the primitive repair tissue that grows has a name and is made out of something specific. We call it granulation tissue. And granulation tissue is immature tissue that is a mass of proliferating fibroblasts and endothelial cells. The endothelial cells are going to make tubes that create new blood vessels, and the fibroblasts eventually are going to produce a lot of extracellular matrix, mostly collagen, that is responsible for restoring the integrity to the area of lost tissue, and it's very, very strong. At the stage where we call it granulation tissue, there's almost no collagen. It's really just cells that are dividing and growing. So lots and lots of endothelial cells, lots and lots of fibroblasts. So when you see the word granulation tissue, you should think of something that's pretty primitive and actively growing. Have you heard of granulation tissue before? Yeah. In what context? Where do you see it? Think about that. We'll come back to it. When the scar matures, we don't call the tissue granulation tissue anymore. And when it's mature, it's mostly collagen, hardly any cells. What happened to the cells? How did they disappear? We have that mass of proliferating endothelial cells and fibroblasts in the early stage of connective tissue repair. How did they disappear by the end when we have almost all collagen and almost no cells? What do you think? How's the way we could get rid of them when we don't need them anymore? Apoptosis. They die through apoptosis. Yeah, we don't need them anymore. All right. Method of repair in an actual wound where we have an injury and we've lost cells and tissue depends on, clearly, the regenerative capacity of the cells in the area, the cells that were lost, if they have the capacity to replicate and provide specialized replacements. But it also depends on the size of the wound. The larger the wound, the greater the likelihood that the growth of our granulation tissue is going to outpace the growth of our specialized cells. And the extent of tissue loss in terms of the framework, that background framework, the walls that provide the structure for the specialized cells. When we lose our framework, we're in a lot of trouble. The framework is actually very important. So perfect repair depends on having cells that can replicate and are happy to do so quickly, and preservation of that stromal framework. When we have the framework, when the walls are intact, the regenerating cells can find the correct place to restore the normal architecture, which is what will best help to have those cells do their normal function when the repair process is done. So really good repair, got to be able to regenerate specialized cells and have to be able to put them back in the right place, which means that framework needs to still be present. These are our overall steps of wound healing. I think we need to talk about them conceptually. I literally never test them. But we have the injury, that's point zero, ground zero. Number one, we have our acute inflammatory host response, which starts immediately after the injury. Next, we start proliferating new cells, and they migrate into position. That includes generic connective tissue cells and parenchymal cells if they have the capacity to regenerate, whatever, depending on where we are. Next, we have some maturation. So we are producing our extracellular matrix proteins like collagen. Then we move on to remodeling, because it's kind of haphazard to begin with, and we have to clean it up and finesse it. Do we do work in our profession where finesse is important? Yes. So in the repair process, we have to go back and finesse things as well. That's the remodeling process. And remodeling involves both the specialized elements and the connective tissue elements. So that's kind of how it works overall. We have some wound healing models that are important for us in dentistry because they are the models that we have to live with when we have wounds that involve oral mucosa. These are models that we know about through skin repair models. So the timeline on them is for skin, but oral mucosa runs an analogous process to skin with one exception. It's faster. We are very privileged to work in a very forgiving environment. Oral mucosa heals beautifully and quickly. It's very forgiving, which some of us need more than others. Anyway, some of our patients need more than others. But real wounds are always going to involve more than one cell type. So when we have a real wound, we're always going to have some specialized cells that are lost and some generic cells that are lost. And we're always going to have some regeneration of specialized cells, maybe, or we need to, and some regeneration of connective tissue that's going to make scar tissue. And depending on what tissues are present in a real wound, one of those processes dominates over the other. So even though we have multiple tissues that are present and affected, in a real wound, it's either going to be more regeneration of specialized cells or more connective tissue repair, producing a scar tissue patch. So when we think about our skin and mucosal wounds, the two models, one with almost no scarring and the other with lots of scarring, are these two models, healing by first intention and healing by second intention. And we want to learn about those processes. Healing by first intention is also known as healing by primary union. You cannot mix and match the terms. It's always first intention or primary union. But don't scramble it, because then nobody knows what you're talking about. We get healing by first intention when we have a small wound. It could be a very precise incision line in skin or mucosa, created by a surgeon with a scalpel blade and a steady hand, so it's a neat, clean line. Or it could be a natural wound, but it's still a wound that has a pretty clean edge, and the edges can be reapproximated. They can be put back together, so they come really close together and fit beautifully and can be sutured, so they stay closed. Hopefully all of our surgeons do that kind of work. Doesn't always happen, depends on what you're doing. But even some natural wounds, accidental injuries, can be sutured tightly closed and the wound margins reapproximated very precisely. So in those situations, we're going to get healing by first intention. In healing by second intention, it also has another name, it's secondary union. We see this when we have larger wounds. Sometimes they're broad and shallow. Sometimes they're broad and deep. Sometimes they're all kinds of irregular shapes. But what they have in common is They do not have a wound margin that can be brought together and sutured closed. If you fall down and skin your knee and just scrape the surface, can you pull that together and suture it? No, because it's very, very shallow and very, very broad. So that's going to heal by second intention. If it's superficial enough, it's kind of no big deal. But if it's a deeper one, that's maybe a problem. If we have a traumatic injury where maybe some of the tissue was lost, or it's a very jagged wound, and you can't pull it together tightly and line up the edges very well, you're going to get healing by second intention as well. So the key is that you can't close the wound, and you're going to have gaps. You have space that has to be filled. When you have space that has to be filled, then you're going to get healing by secondary union. When we have healing by first intention, where we have a nice clean wound edge that can be sutured, nice and tightly closed, lined up beautifully, healing occurs in a very predictable fashion, and studies have been done, so we know literally what happens on pretty much a day-by-day basis. So we know what happens on day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sort of that kind of timeline. So you get to learn what happens on the individual days. And should be aware that we know the timeline for healing by first intention. Day 1 is the first 24 hours after the injury or surgery. And the very first thing is that a blood clot forms to seal the wound. If you suture it closed tightly, is there a lot of blood clot? No. And plastic surgeons, in order to prevent scarring, actually wash the wound margins before they suture to minimize the amount of blood clot. Because the more clot, the more scar. So you want to have some clot so it scabs and seals, have some fibrin to stop bleeding, but you want minimal clot, minimal scarring. But that blood clot seals the wound. It keeps out bacteria. It's really important. What about kids that pick at their scabs when they skin their knees? Not a good thing. Let it fall off on its own. It's doing a good thing. It's keeping out bacteria. So leave the scab alone. The other thing that happens, like the blood clot is first, and like moments later, the acute inflammatory host response begins, and we start seeing some recruitment of our inflammatory cells. We have a diagram that shows neutrophils lining up at the wound margins. So this is within the first 24 hours that we start getting some inflammation going on at the edges of the wound. This is blown up pretty big, so it shows lots of clot, but we really want less than that. And then the third thing that happens by the end of the 24 hours, by the end of the first day, is we are actually already growing new epithelial cells. Does that mean that we have them all the way to the top? No, that just means that we've got some basal cells that have already divided to produce a few replacements. And that's because they were already in the business of doing that. So, not done at all, but we already have some new cells that are proliferating, and the first new cells to proliferate are going to be the basal epithelial cells of the overlying skin. On day 2, which is kind of 24 to 48 hours, of course, inflammation continues, but we also start getting our connective tissue cells starting to divide. And so at the edge of the wound, we start growing some fibroblasts and endothelial cells, and they're going to start migrating into the blood clot, and they follow along the fibrin of the blood clot, so that we don't want to have no blood clot because it's kind of helping our repair cells migrate into the wound space. By 48 hours, we're actually going to reconnect the epithelium from one side to the other. So that's pretty fast. So we call that bridging, when new epithelium from one side of the wound space connects in the middle with new epithelium from the other side. But in that first 48 hours, it's only the basal cell layer that is reconnected. Are we going to take out our sutures? No. A single layer of basal epithelial cells are not going to hold our wound closed So we have far to go, but we have bridged at least the basal cell layer of the epithelium. On day 3, we have more of the same. We're proliferating more cells, and we have ongoing inflammation. The inflammatory cells are removing the blood clot as we no longer need it because we've grown new tissue cells into the wound space. And the important thing that happens on day 3 is that we now have lots of macrophages that have moved in to take over the work of the neutrophils that are dying off by the dozens. When the neutrophils and macrophages are breaking down the blood clot, when it's no longer needed, removing any debris that might be there, we call that wound debridement. You know the word debridement. So this just refers to debridement of the inside of the wound by our host cells. Day 4 is more of the same, so it's not on the list. Day 5, at least by day 5, we now have our connective tissue bridging. So on the connective tissue side of the wound, the underneath side, our granulation tissue has grown in from either side and connected in the middle. So that proliferation of fibroblasts and endothelial cells has bridged the wound space. Can we take out the sutures yet? Still not yet. In the mouth, you can usually take out sutures at day 5, definitely not on skin. So just that mass of proliferating cells is not strong enough to hold the wound closed. We need to wait a little bit longer, and that's because we haven't produced enough extracellular matrix, almost no extracellular matrix. By the end of the first week, the granulation tissue is starting to mature enough to be making some collagen, but we still don't have a lot of collagen. By the end of the second week, our epithelium has regenerated to full thickness and full strength, and we now have enough collagen produced by the connective tissue elements, the fibroblasts, that we can remove the sutures. So skin sutures are usually removed at 2 weeks, 14 days. If you go as early as 10 days, it can pull back apart. So usually, and if you're in an area where there's a lot of motion and pulling, like on your elbows or knees, you might even need to go longer than 2 weeks. We aren't doing as much wound debridement. The clot's all gone by this time, and so inflammation is starting to back off, but the scar is still bright red. They tend to look a little purplish, a fresh scar. Why is it red? If the inflammation has diminished, why is it red?
I have a question. In our handout, you said it's blanched. I thought blanched meant white.
It is. Blanch does mean white, and we're getting to that in just a second.
Because there's still...
So why is the fresh scar at the end of the second week bright red?
Still
Does it have a lot of blood, as in blood clot? No, because we debrided that away. The macrophages and neutrophils removed it.
The neutrophils are still there.
The neutrophils have mostly disappeared, and the macrophages mostly disappeared. Why is it bright red?
Collagen.
Collagen is white, and the inflammation has diminished. So what was our granulation tissue made out of? Fibroblasts and endothelial cells. And what do the endothelial cells make? Blood vessels. Tubes of blood vessels. So the scar is very vascular. It's very, very vascular. Because when you're repairing a wound, you need to be able to bring in lots of nutrients and protein and blah, 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 all your supplies to grow new cells and make extracellular matrix proteins. So you got to have a blood supply. So our repair tissue is very vascular. And at the end of the second week, that scar is mature enough to take out the sutures, but it's still a very, very red scar. So what happens next is our process of remodeling and maturation. And that's where the blanching occurs. And the blanching is a very gradual process where the vascularity slowly diminishes as we no longer need that abundant blood supply in the area of the scar. How do those blood vessels disappear? Apoptosis again, we don't need them anymore. They die through apoptosis. Question, there was another one back.
You mentioned that the scarring can be red because it's vascular.
At the beginning, a new scar is quite red or purplish, depending on how deep it is. But an old scar, a mature scar, is quite white because all that's left by then is mostly collagen, and collagen is quite white. So, in the remodeling and maturation process, the inflammation resolves, the inflammatory cells go away, the extra blood vessels disappear through apoptosis, but we also have some remodeling of the connective tissue elements. When the fibroblasts first make collagen, they make an immature form of collagen, and the collagen fibrils are very haphazardly placed. Just get something there that'll hold it together. And in the remodeling process, we actually break down those primitive collagen fibers and replace them with mature collagen fibrils that are functionally oriented. So what does functionally oriented mean? Arranged so they work. So they're going to line up parallel to the surface so they prevent it from pulling apart, because collagen is very strong, it has high tensile strength, so the collagen fibers are going to line up parallel to the surface to hold it together. But that takes a while. It takes a while for that level of maturation to occur, and can take months. It can take a long time. And the blanching process can take a really long time. So it just takes a while. So we move on to healing by second intention, the model of skin and mucosal repair that occurs when we have a larger wound, where we have a surface that cannot be sutured tightly closed. We have gaps. The sequence of events mostly parallels healing by second intention, but the problem is, because it's a bigger wound and it can't be sutured tightly closed, we cannot predict what happens on a day-by-day basis. We can just predict the order of the events, because how long it actually takes is going to depend on the actual size of the wound and how much repair tissue has to be grown to fill in the wound space. And some wound spaces are really big, and it can take months sometimes. We have a lot more acute inflammation. The larger the wound, the greater the injury, the more intense and prolonged our acute inflammatory process is, the longer it takes to debride the wound, which is the job of acute inflammation. It's cleaning up the mess. The larger wound also produces more granulation tissue. The more granulation tissue you produce, the more scar tissue you will have in the end. The granulation tissue is always going to be replaced by collagen, which is your ultimate form of your scar. So in healing by second intention, we have scarring. It's unavoidable, and usually there are clinically detectable scars. Do plastic surgeons plan for healing by second intention? Never. We pay them big bucks to avoid it and to have undetectable incision lines when you're done healing. So they need to have very good surgical techniques, and they need to be able to control the repair process so we don't get a lot of granulation tissue and we don't get a lot of scarring. Yes?
Is there anything that we can do to prevent the secondary union from being as bad, I guess? Like icing, or I don't know.
The icing.
I don't know, I'm just making up stuff. But.
In the oral cavity, secondary union occurs in certain contexts. If you're having a surgical procedure, usually an intentional surgery, we have incision lines that are pretty neat and clean, and we can suture them. So most of the time with surgical procedures, we are working with a situation that will heal by primary union. The problem is in periodontics, grafting procedures. So have you learned about periodontal grafts? So if a person has a periodontal defect, they can harvest tissue from some other place in the mouth and put it where there's a periodontal defect to repair the defect. But then where you harvest it from, there's going to be a hole. So one of the most common places to harvest tissue for to get your periodontal graft tissue is the hard palate. So you take a little square piece from hard palate. So can you suture the hard palate? Why can't you suture the hard palate? Because it's mucosa bound to bone and it doesn't move. Even if you do a little periosteal release, it still doesn't move very much. So those have to heal by second intention. We call it granulating in. They can take a while to granulate in, but because we live and work in a place that's very forgiving, those almost always heal into normal contours. We are very, very blessed. So, and it heals pretty nicely, but it is healing by second intention. Sometimes oral surgeons remove teeth and don't suture the sockets and just leave it open, and the surface will heal by second intention. The bone heals a little bit differently. For the bone healing, it doesn't matter if you suture it or not, it's going to heal the same way. But things always proceed faster if you suture, if it's possible. So in our healing by second intention, since we don't know the exact timeline, I do want you to know the order of events, the sequence of events. And number one, we do have a blood clot that fills the wound. The blood clot is extremely important because it is going to seal the wound to keep out bacteria and prevent infection. But it also provides the fibrin framework for new cells to migrate on once they finally get there. And the blood clot needs to hang around for a while. So having good blood clotting is actually very important for healing by second intention. We don't want more than necessary, but we don't want less than necessary either. The second thing that happens, which is immediately afterwards, on the heels of the blood clotting process, is our acute inflammatory host response. Depending on the size of the wound debridement process can take a really long time. You think about people who have had major traumatic injuries, and they can be in the hospital for weeks granulating it. My father had a tractor injury when he was a kid. He grew up on a rice farm, and the tractor flipped over and the steering column went through his groin and left a jagged hole. They didn't think he'd ever walk again. He did have to give up track and field, but he walks just fine. He was treated by a World War II Army surgeon. They stitched him back together the best they could and put him in a body cast for 6 months.
Oh my God.
Because they knew it was going to take that long to heal by secondary union. And so he was in that cast for a very, very long time. So major traumatic wounds can take a long time to granulate in. And so your wound debridement's going to take a really long time too. The third thing that happens is that the granulation tissue cells, the fibroblasts and endothelial cells, start growing at the wound margins. This is one place where it is different from healing by first intention. The first cells that were really growing and migrating were the epithelial cells in healing by first intention. But in second intention, the granulation tissue is ahead and grows in from the wound margins into the blood clot. But it only goes as far as the acute inflammatory process has debrided the wound. So acute inflammation has to clean up the mess to prepare a space for the granulation tissue to grow into. And then the fourth thing that happens is that the epithelial cells begin to proliferate and grow in from the wound margins, and they actually migrate across the top of the granulation tissue. So the granulation tissue is always one step ahead of the growing, advancing wall of epithelial cells at the surface. What happened next is a process that is unique to healing by second intention, and that is wound contraction. The granulation tissue that has been growing into the wound space actually takes on contractile properties, as if it was muscle cell. They have that ability when they're still primitive, And so the wound can contract and pull the edges in. And this is a phenomenon that helps shrink the remaining wound space. So it will speed up healing. Sometimes wound contraction can shrink it down to as little as 10% of its original wound size. Talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. And after the wound contracts and shrinks, then it finishes granulating in, which means our connective tissue bridging is complete. Our granulation tissue grows in from both sides, connects in the middle, and the wound space has now been filled with our connective tissue repair tissue. And after that has finished bridging, then our epithelium can finish bridging the surface. And once we have epithelial bridging, then the epithelium can proliferate and ultimately reach full thickness. And then we go on to our maturation process, where we start producing a lot of collagen, and we have the remodeling process and those kinds of things. But I do want to talk a little bit about wound contraction. So it occurs in wounds with large surface area, pulls it together, shrinks the wound size, so you don't have to grow as much repair tissue to bridge the wound space. And again, can get it down to pretty small. When I was in high school, I got to witness wound contraction. I had no idea what it was at the time, but it's a great example, and it was pretty graphic. The memory stays with me still. We had a black cat named King Tut. He was beautiful. He ran the neighborhood. Even the dogs in the neighborhood would come to his rescue if he got in trouble, because he ran the neighborhood. And we got new neighbors that moved in next door that also had a black cat, and our black cats did not like each other. And they got in a big fight. And I discovered after their big fight that my cat King Tut had an abscess in his abdomen, a really bad abscess. So we took him to the vet, and the vet said, oh, that's going to need surgical cleaning out, and leave him here and come back tomorrow and pick him up. So we came back the next day, and the vet said, here's your cat, and here's how to take care of him. And he hands us the cat. The cat's got a hole in his abdomen the size of a quarter. You can look in and see his intestines. I kid you not. The abscess went through the muscle wall, and they had to clean all of that out, this big open wound. And the vet says, and here's what you need to do. Every morning and every evening, you need to pour hydrogen peroxide into the hole and let it bubble out. And when it's done bubbling out, then you take this little bottle of antibiotic liquid and you put 3 drops of antibiotic in the hole.
King Tut.
Yeah, and my family looked at me and looked at each other, and they said, that's your job. So yes, I got to do that. So every morning and every evening. And after about 3 or 4 days, it wasn't very long, it was just a few days, I got up in the morning, corralled the cat to have the hydrogen peroxide ready, and my little bottle, it actually had a dropper tip, a little tiny skinny dropper tip. And I could see the hole, but it was so small you could not pour anything into it, and I couldn't even get the tip of the dropper bottle in the hole. So the night before, it was probably down to about dime size, and overnight it had gone from dime size to pinpoint wound contraction. So once it started going, it really contracted fast. And it was like, what? How did that happen? I didn't know what it was, but I was pretty happy because I didn't have to do the hydrogen peroxide drops anymore. But that's wound contraction. So it is a wonderful event that happens in healing by second intention to help shrink the wound size so it can finish healing faster and be done with it and restore the integrity to the tissue. I think I will post this diagram so you can kind of see side-by-side differences between healing by first intention and healing by second intention. It makes a nice little review diagram. So in the little bit of time that we have left, I want to talk about things that go wrong with repair, complications of repair and aberrations of repair. I have a couple of aberrations that we want to talk about. Aberrations where our connective tissue repair goes awry and develops problems. The first one is keloid formation. So keloids are not the same as hypertrophic scars. They're not just big scars. They are actually a very specific type of scar that occurs due to excess production of collagen in connective tissue repair due to a genetic defect. So you actually inherit an enzyme deficiency, an enzyme that's part of the remodeling process. So I told you in connective tissue repair, the collagen fibers are all initially haphazardly arranged all over the place, every which direction. And then we break them down and replace them with collagen that's mature and functionally oriented. Some people are missing the gene to make an enzyme necessary to break down the primitive collagen. So in the maturation process, they just add more collagen. Instead of replacing the primitive collagen, they just add more collagen on top of it. And so they get very large, very bulky scars. And one of the best ways to prevent keloid formation is controlling wounds, so its primary intention, almost no collagen needs to be generated, and that really helps things along. What population carries the defect the most? What gene pool is it in? It is more prevalent in individuals of African origin. You see it more in that population, but it's in all populations at this point. And see how the overlying epithelium is very thin and kind of looks tissue papery? That's very characteristic. Some women don't know that they are keloid formers until they get their ears pierced, and then they get this big lumpy scar that forms on their earlobes. And then you have to have those removed by the plastic surgeon and controlled so it doesn't grow back. So it's pretty nasty.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my Lord. So he looks like he got like slit in the throat, but I don't know. I don't know the story behind. But that's a legitimate keloid. So that's a very unique type of aberration repair.
Can it be smaller than that? Or is that
It
like
can be smaller, but there are also what we call hypertrophic scars that are just bigger scars than normal that can occur in anybody. And these are way above and beyond that. The other aberration of repair where our connective tissue repair gets out of hand is what we call proud flesh. This occurs when we have a wound on skin. I've never seen it. Well, actually, I've seen it on mucosa. It does occur in the mouth. But it occurs because there's an overgrowth of granulation tissue. Usually occurs when there's a problem with the clot. We lose the clot. So the repair process loses its boundaries. And so we get a mound of granulation tissue that grows above the surface. And one of the problems is that the epithelial cells can't migrate up over this mountain of granulation tissue, and it usually has to be surgically removed to allow healing to progress normally. This is a mound of granulation tissue on a finger wound. I've seen it around fingernails, edges of fingernails, a lump of granulation tissue. It's not one that we see an awful lot, but it is possible. And like I said, usually requires some surgical revision. We also have complications that produce delays in wound healing. Things that happen that slow down the healing process. So I'd like you to know a little bit about those. They can be either local origin factors or systemic factors, and we're going to talk about local factors first. Infection, top of the list with a big star by it because it is the single most common cause of delayed wound healing. When we get secondary infection, you have to control the infection. Our acute inflammatory host response has to neutralize the assault before we can progress with our wound healing. So have you all seen those ads on TV for Neosporin, how it speeds healing? Yeah, well, it kind of does. It just really, more than anything else, prevents delayed wound healing, more so than actually speeding healing. But it prevents delayed wound healing because it prevents secondary infection. So that's an important one. Who gets secondary infection of wounds really, really, really easy? What kind of patient? Immunocompromised, especially diabetics. Diabetics really have problems with that. Another thing that's a local factor is foreign bodies. If you have foreign material embedded in the wound, that needs to be isolated or removed, or it delays wound healing. It festers in there, causes more granulation tissue to form. Another one that can happen is what we call mechanical wound dehiscence. The wound reopens. The wound margins were not stabilized adequately and it pulled apart. And basically it's re-injured and it has to start all over. Whenever you have wound dehiscence, you're going to get more granulation tissue, you're going to get more scar tissue. So, if you have a surface wound where you're really needing it to stay together, sutures can be really good. What's an alternative to sutures? Well, I mean, without penetrating the surface. Butterfly Band-Aids. Sometimes those are steri strips, but sometimes they come off. Don't trust a little kid with those. They pull them off. So sometimes, even though we don't, when you got a little wiggly kid, you don't really want to do sutures sometimes. It would be so nice if you could do steri strips, but they don't always work. My son, my precious boy, 18 months old, decided to take a dive off the sofa. He was standing on the sofa, which was forbidden, and I told him to sit down, and he didn't want to sit down, so he took a step back. I'm going to get away from Mom because she's going to make me sit down. And he fell over backwards and landed on his head right next to the hearth. I actually thought he had hit the brick of the hearth, but instead he landed on a little plastic truck that slid open his scalp about this long. We went to the emergency room. I was eating a peach and had a paper towel in my hand, and I slammed it on his head because it hit an artery and he was actually going.
Oh my God.
That was real fun. So we drove to the emergency room and they put in 10 staples. And they said, come back, go to your pediatrician and have them taken out at 10 days.
You picked him out.
Well, the scalp is very stable. It shouldn't pull apart. We took him out at 10 days like we were instructed to do so. It pulled apart and he ended up with a huge hematoma there. And he has a scar that's like 1/4 of an inch wide in his scalp to this day. So that's wound dehiscence. So that was 18 months. When he was 3 or 4 at the Children's Center, just on the other side of campus, he was playing out in the yard, and they have a stump in one of the yards, and he was standing on the stump, and they were running around the stump and jumping off, and somehow or another, his eyebrow and the stump made contact and split his eyebrow. And the Children's Center made us take him to the emergency room because it happened on their watch, and they said, oh, you have to take him to the emergency room. So we did. We were there for 4 hours. They had a 4th-year medical student treat him with steri strips, which were gone within 1 hour of leaving the emergency room. So he has like 2 eyebrows on that side because he has a nice little scar in the middle. So that's wound dehiscence. Sometimes it's better to suture and leave those sutures in until they have done their job, because if you can't hold the wound margins together and it pulls apart, you're going to get more scar tissue. Inadequate blood supply can delay healing because you can't get your nutrients and proteins and glucose and things to the site. That's a problem in diabetics too. Systemic factors that compromise wound healing, delay wound healing, is not enough nutrition. You need protein to make protein. Collagen's a protein. You need protein to make cells, calories for repair. Vitamin C you need to make collagen. And you need lots of zinc. Do you know what you need zinc for? Zinc is part of the enzymes used in remodeling to break down the primitive collagen so it can be replaced with mature collagen. So if you don't have enough zinc, you don't get good remodeling, and the end product is not as nice. And then, of course, diseases can delay wound healing. Diabetics are notorious for delayed wound healing. They have compromised acute inflammation. They have sugar everywhere, which feeds bacteria, so they get secondary infection. They don't have good blood supply. They have lots of problems. And too much steroids, normal cortisol even, delays wound healing. Do you know why? inhibits fibroblasts. So more of a good thing is not always better. There was a question. I saw a question.
Zinc, can you take it?
Yes, you can take it. And some surgeons will actually recommend that you start taking a zinc vitamin C vitamin about a week before a planned surgery so you have plenty on board. And you keep taking it until you're repaired. And it speeds healing. Absolutely. All right, we have a quiz on Friday. And it covers everything we've covered so far.
Will it cover Friday? Will it cover Wednesday?
No, it will not cover for Wednesday, but it covers everything that we covered up till now. 3 topics. And you will have a schedule posted that has the quiz schedule on it before the end of the day. And then you'll know what's on all of our quizzes. Dr. Richardson, who called me Dr. Richardson?
Oh my gosh.
Guys, quick announcement. Our religion class is going to be separated into 2 sections. So if you go back into your student services account, where you do your registration portal, you'll notice where which teacher you have. So Dr. Ma is going to be in 3226. And I believe the other teacher is Dr. Cho, I'm not sure. His room is 3214.
3226, 32.
Where are you? Your mommy too.
Yeah, I met somebody telling me I was a histo TA, and I had histo and lost her.
Everybody loves Dr. Yes. Oh, you were lucky to work with him. Oh,
yes.
very cool.
So I happens next.
Wait, what's the profession? We actually look at some of his talks because it kind of makes sense why it is the way it is. So we'll enjoy it.
So where is it that you make
I don't think you can check it out. I think you already got it here. At least not through the app. Because I can't find mine. Yeah.